Hello and welcome to Star Wars Obsessed. I'm Richard and Solo Weapons! So lately I've been purchasing quite a bit of Stan Solo figures, and Stan Solo is so awesome that you purchase a certain amount and he'll send you some reproduction weapons, which look absolutely awesome. How do they compare with the original vintage? Let's check them out. Alright, first thing I want to look at is the Vibro Axe. This is Stan Solo's. Let's look at the original vintage. Not exactly the same. As you can see, the vintage, the wood part is a darker brown than the Stan Solo version. This is very flexible. How about the Stan Solo? No, not as much. This one is stiffer. So you can totally tell the difference between these two. How about a Luke Skywalker lightsaber? Here's my original. I played a little too rough with this figure and lost the tip. The Stan Solo is a brighter yellow than this shade. This shade is a kind of a darker, maybe a more of a mustard, I guess? Here are the Obi-Wan Kenobi lightsaber. Oh no, which one is Stan Solo and which one is the original vintage? This one is the original vintage. And it looks like this part right here is a bit wider than the original. The color is kind of different too. Original seems to be a lighter blue than the Stan Solo. And now the Darth Vader. Ooh, I didn't take very good care of my Darth Vader lightsaber. Look at that. But here is the Stan Solo version, which is a completely different color. The original vintage seems to be a bit less of a red and more of a orange shade, whereas the Stan Solo is very red. Here's an original vintage gaffy stick. Let's take a look at Stan Solo's version. The original vintage seems to have a different shade of brown, but pretty much looks the same. Although the detailing on the Stan Solo is finer, whereas this one seems a bit rough around the edges. Here's a vintage yellow lightsaber. And here's a Stan Solo lightsaber. Color is slightly different. The handguard here is slightly different. Oh, the Stan Solo looks a little bit longer too. Vintage and Stan Solo. Colors very different. Vintage blue lightsaber, Stan Solo lightsaber. You can see the color difference. Vintage gray blaster, Stan Solo blaster. It's very hard to tell the difference on this one. Yeah, that's a tough one. Vintage blaster and Stan Solo blaster. You can see the color difference, and the detailing here is very different from the Stan Solo detail. This blaster is vintage, this one is Stan Solo. This one's a tough one to tell the difference. Pretty awesome. Original Imperial blaster, vintage, and Stan Solo. Looks pretty good, pretty close, pretty amazing. Vintage black blaster and Stan Solo blaster. These you can totally tell the difference because the detailing here, like here on the Stan Solo, it's flat, whereas the vintage is a bit more detailed, raised. Here's my vintage Leia blaster and the Stan Solo. Pretty much the same. Looks like maybe there's a bit more detail on the top part. Alright, reproduction on the bottom, original vintage on the top. The only thing I can tell is that this is a slightly darker gray. The Han Solo type blaster, this is the reproduction and this is the original vintage. The original seems a bit more detailed, finer detail than the reproduction. This is the original vintage and this is a reproduction. Finer detail on the vintage, whereas the reproduction is a bit flat. Reproduction and vintage. The reproduction is a little bit of a lighter gray. And here are all the weapons that I got from Stan Solo Creations. And they look great. I have no problems with reproductions, and I welcome these in my collection to put on display with all my other figures. And thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next Star Wars Obsessed. Here's a vintage blue lightsaber.